Please let us stay." The words came before the old orc could even ask her name. The young widow stood at the bottom of the porch steps, road, worn and thin, yet her spine was straight as a spear shaft. "Your land grows too heavy for one pair of claws," she said, "and my whelps have no door to close against the coming frost." She did not beg. She laid the truth down like a stone on the table between them. At her side stood a boy of 11 winters, watching the porch with the flat, waiting eyes of someone who already expected to be turned away. A little girl of 7 pressed her cold green hands into the folds of her mother's skirt and said nothing at all. The first cold wind of the harvest moon swept across the high grass of the broken ridges. It moved soft, almost gentle, but it carried a warning underneath it that any old survivor could read. Winter was coming early this year, and it would not knock politely. On the porch stood Temperza, 72 winters old and entirely alone. She had spent a lifetime keeping this land alive, but the frontier at the edge of the ridges was a hard master. It asked for more than her aging hands could give now, and it did not care how much she had already given. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind pushed grit against the door. Temperza looked at the whelps first, then at the barn, the leaning stakes of the fence, the silent stone windows behind her. The widow had not brought a plea dressed up in pretty words. She had brought a fact, and she had brought it plain. Cordrain Holding rested near the broken ridges above the wide river, where open grass gave way to rough country and winter always came before anyone felt ready for it. From a distance the place still looked proud. The stone barn still stood. The old cottonwoods still lined the creek. Smoke still climbed from the chimney most mornings. A traveler passing on the road would have seen a working holding. Someone who knew the land would have seen something very different. 4 winters had passed since Morduk, the smith orc who had raised every fence line and every outbuilding with his own broad hands, was laid to rest on a quiet slope beyond the pasture. Nothing had fallen down overnight. The failing came a little at a time, the way it always does. One vein gone from the windmill, the deep well demanding more strength with every bucket. Cold air slipping through the north wall of the cattle barn. The root cellar holding too much damp. The haystack facing the wrong wind, stakes leaning a little farther every spring. Temperza still followed the same round she and Morduk had built together over the long years. The land remembered those habits. Her body no longer could. That evening she settled into Morduk's old carved seat on the porch. The land stretched out before her exactly as she had loved it for decades. For the first time it no longer felt like land waiting for orders. It felt like land waiting, quietly, for someone strong enough to answer them. She looked down at the widow again, and she waited without speaking. The young orc understood the weight of that silence. On the frontier you earned trust by telling the truth even when it cut you to do it. So she gathered herself, and she began. Her mate had been a warrior orc named Kael. 3 moons past he had ridden down into a dry wash to free 2 heifers trapped in the mud. A flood came without warning, roaring down out of the high country the way those floods did. The cattle scrambled free. Kael did not. Only after they had buried him did the clan debt come due. The debt holders claimed the small den, the last of the herd, and near everything the family had built together with their own hands. What remained fit inside a single wooden chest. 2 wool hides. A coil of rawhide. A cloth-bound book filled with Kael's careful notes. A small pouch holding turnip and bean seed. Nothing else in all the world. For 4 days the widow had walked, keeping to the wagon tracks and the clan roads instead of passing through the towns. She would not let strangers remember her whelps as beggars. The boy carried his father's book pressed against his chest every mile of it. The little girl hugged the seed pouch as if it were her most beloved doll. On the third night the boy had asked, quiet in the dark, "Do we still have a den?" The widow had looked toward the black horizon a long moment before she answered. "Not yet," she said. As the widow's story came to its close, Temperza let the silence stretch out between them again. She had watched too many smooth-tongued travelers drift across the frontier with tragic tales and empty hands. Pity had never kept a holding alive. Neither had a well-told sorrow. "What can you do?" she asked at last. The widow answered without rushing, and she did not waste a word. She wasted nothing in the kitchen, she said. A sack of flour or a handful of beans lasted longer in her hands than most folk would credit. She could mend a broken harness with rawhide, and she knew the great horned cattle as well as any hand who ever drew wage. Fowl never troubled her. When winter crept through cracked walls, she mixed clay and straw and sealed the drafts before they could steal the warmth. If the root cellar turned damp, she knew how to dry it before the roots spoiled in the dark. And every evening she counted grain, divided the hay, and kept a ledger that matched the barn instead of matching someone's fond memory. Temperza listened without changing her face. Then she turned her eyes on the boy. "Can you milk?" The boy nodded once. "My father taught me." He held up his hands, and there was no shame in it. "My claws are small. They'll grow stronger." The old orc turned toward the little girl. The child stood quiet beside her mother while the north wind nudged the kitchen door against its worn frame. Temperza looked back at the widow. "I do not keep charity under my roof," she said. "I keep work. If you can work, you can eat here." The widow did not thank her with tears. She simply bowed her head. The weight on her shoulders did not vanish. It shifted, just enough to let her stand a little straighter. For the first time in many days, the ground beneath her family no longer felt as if it were sliding out from under them. Her name was Vashka, she told the old orc as they climbed the steps. The boy was Grull. The little one was Niza. Temperza only grunted and led them through the kitchen to the small room behind it. For years it had served as nothing more than winter storage. Two narrow bunks leaned against opposite walls. A wooden crate still held old horseshoe nails, oilcloth, and spare lantern glass, and broken harness buckles rested beneath a shelf furred thick with dust. The room smelled of cedar, lamp oil, and seasons that had already come and gone. Vashka thanked her with a nod and went straight to work. She folded one wool hide and tucked it tight along the crack beneath the door where the north wind slipped inside. She set Niza's bunk against the inner wall, the warmest place in the room. Grull dragged his own bunk beside the doorway without being told to. "If someone comes," he said softly, "I'll hear them first." Vashka did not argue with him. She only pulled the second hide over both whelps before she blew out the lamp. It was the instinct of a warrior line, that watchfulness, and she would not shame it out of him. Across the house, Temperza lay awake beneath the cover Morduk's mother had stitched decades earlier. The holding settled into its familiar night sounds. Timbers creaked. The wind brushed the porch. Somewhere outside a loose chain tapped gently against the well frame. Then came sounds the house had not carried in years. Niza coughed once in her sleep. A few moments later, the boy whispered through the dark, "Will she cast us out tomorrow?" There was a pause before Vashka answered, "Only if we fail the work." Silence returned. Temperza stared at the timber ceiling above her. She remembered something Morduk had often said after walking the fence lines in the failing light. "A holding dies first at the edges, nobody bothers to inspect." She almost turned toward the empty side of the bed. Almost spoke his name. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, the old house breathed with more than one lonely soul in it. Vashka woke long before the first gray light reached the eastern ridge. She moved quiet through the unfamiliar kitchen, opening the cupboards one at a time. A sack of cornmeal rested beside a crock of dried beans. A small tin still held a little of something like coffee, dark and bitter. There was lard enough for one careful breakfast. She split a few dry cottonwood sticks and coaxed the hearth back to life. Soon the stove carried a steady heat instead of yesterday's dead ashes, and the smell of something warm drifted through the house. Temperza stopped in the doorway. For moons her breakfast had been little more than stale flatbread softened in reheated dregs. Cooking for one had slowly become another chore she no longer cared to finish. Vashka said nothing about any of it. She filled a bowl and set it in front of the old orc before she served herself. Instead of sitting at the table, she stayed near the stove where she could watch both the fire and her whelps. Outside, Grull crossed the frost-white yard to check the cattle's water trough before anyone asked him to. Inside, Niza crouched beneath the table and found an old wooden button coated in dust. She rubbed it clean on her sleeve, walked to Temperza, and set it beside the old orc's bowl. "I think it belongs here," she whispered. Temperza finished every bite without a word. When Vashka turned back toward the stove, the old orc quietly pulled the small chair closer to the fire. "Niza," she said softly, "come warm your claws." The first week passed without a single dramatic moment. That was how most holdings decided whether someone belonged, not through speeches, but through the plain grind of routine. Temperza never explained her round. Vashka learned it by watching. The grain sacks were always checked before sundown. The barn doors had to be latched the moment the wind shifted north. Water came up from the deep well before the afternoon chill settled into the rope. Nothing happened by accident on that land, and nothing was allowed to. Outside, Grull gathered eggs every morning, then counted them again before dusk. The numbers never stayed in his head. He scratched them carefully onto a small slate, just as his father had once taught him to. Niza followed her mother everywhere, gathering dry kindling and learning which patches of grass stayed damp after cold nights. Vashka warned her never to step there. Wet ground stole heat from small bodies faster than most folk realized. There was a rhythm to those first days that neither of them named. The old orc would set to a task, and the widow would appear at her elbow, already understanding it, already reaching for the tool before it was asked for. Twice Temperza turned to say a thing and found it already done. It unsettled her, a little. For 4 winters she had been the only one who knew how this holding wanted to be worked, and now here was a stranger reading the land as fluently as she did. As if the two of them had learned it from the same teacher in the same hard school. Which, in a way, they had. The frontier taught everyone the same lessons. It only asked whether you had survived long enough to learn them. Temperza rarely praised anyone. She watched from a distance. If something was wrong, she corrected it. If it was right, she simply moved on, and that was its own kind of wage. Vashka understood the language of it. Where she came from, praise was cheap and often a lie. A keeper who said nothing and let your work stand was a keeper who trusted you, and trust on the frontier was worth more than any warm word. Late one afternoon, Vashka stepped into the root cellar and paused. The air carried the faint smell of damp. She ran her fingers across one stone wall, then reached into her apron for a small piece of chalk. Without a word, she drew a short white line beside the wet patch. She meant to see whether the damp moved over the next 3 days before she touched a single board or lifted a single shovel. The following morning, Temperza noticed the chalk line. She looked at the stone, then at Vashka. For the first time, she understood something that mattered. The widow did not simply notice a problem. She hunted the reason it had begun. 3 mornings later, Orun Bellwether, A part-time hand who had helped the old couple through countless branding seasons, guided his bay gelding into the yard the way he always had. He expected to find another chore waiting for him. He did not expect to find the holding already moving. Vashka sat beneath the barn awning, mending a broken harness with a strip of soaked rawhide. She pulled each knot tight without wasting a single inch of the leather. When she finished, she returned every awl, needle, and knife to the exact place she had found them. Nearby, Grull counted the morning eggs before writing the number onto his slate. Orun watched a long moment before he looked toward Timperza. "They're working here," she said simply. That was all the explanation either of them needed. He had seen plenty of folk perform when someone was watching. This widow was working as though no one was, and there was a world of difference between the two. Before he climbed back into the saddle, Orun studied the broad haystack near the western pasture. "The north wind's coming early this year," he said. "If that stack keeps facing the weather, the bottom edge will rot before the snow moon." He untied a spare coil of baling twine from his saddle horn and set it beside her. No compliment followed it. She picked up the twine, used it before sundown to secure a loose harness rack, and went back to work. Orun noticed. He smiled to himself before he rode away. The argument began without either of them looking for one. Late that afternoon, Vashka carried a sack of dried beans into the kitchen and noticed an old leather ledger lying open on the table. She never reached for it. But the pages faced upward, and years of keeping accounts had taught her eyes to read numbers before words. Hay, grain, feed, winter reserve. She looked away almost at once. Still, one figure refused to leave her mind. She waited until supper was near finished. Only then did she speak. At that rate, she said quietly, the hay ends before the thaw if the snow stays past the spring melt. The room went perfectly still. Timperza slowly lowered her spoon. That ledger had belonged to Morduk. His hand filled near every page of it. It was the last place in the house that still felt entirely under her control, the last corner that was wholly hers. "Do you make a habit," she asked, her voice turning cold as the well rope, "of reading things that don't belong to you?" Vashka did not step back. "I wasn't reading your memories." She met the old orc's eyes without raising her voice. "I saw numbers." She paused. "I know what wet hay smells like. I know what a hungry beast looks like when the feed runs thin. Those numbers don't leave enough for both." The words hung in the room. Nisa stopped eating. Grull lowered his eyes to his plate. Timperza closed the ledger with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen. The little girl flinched at the sound. Vashka rested a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. She soothed the child. She did not take back a single word. Timperza slept very little that night. Long before sunrise, she pulled on her coat, took up her walking staff, and made her way alone toward the haystack beyond the barn. She counted every stack herself. She said nothing to Vashka until near an hour had passed. "Bring your knife." Together they cut open one bale from the lowest edge, the side that faced the weather. The outside still looked sound. The center did not. A dull brown ring had already begun spreading through the hay like a bruise under green skin. Timperza rubbed the damp strands between her fingers. She did not argue with what she was holding. Vashka knelt beside the stack and pointed toward the shallow slope beyond the pasture. "The rain runs straight to the base," she explained. "The north wind keeps the bottom from ever drying. It loses a little every storm. Not enough to notice at first. Enough to matter by deep winter." She drew a line in the dirt with a stick. The new bales should face east. Lift them onto lodgepole poles, cap the top with a sloped thatch, then cut a drainage trench about 9 fingers deep along the low side. Temperza listened without interruption. No apology came. The spoiled hay had already spoken for her. She looked at the ground a long moment, then handed the shovel to Vashka. "Show me the trench by midday." Orun arrived and helped roll the fresh stack onto the pole base. Grull counted every bale as it moved. That evening Temperza opened Morduk's leather ledger once more. She slid the pencil across the table. "Write the new count," she told the boy. Grull hesitated only a moment before he did exactly that. It was the first page in the ledger that belonged to the future instead of the past, and some part of the old orc knew it even then. 2 days after the hay was moved, Vashka asked to look at the root cellar properly. Temperza stiffened at once. Morduk had built that cellar with his own hands, stone by stone, in the first hard year of their bond. To question it felt too close to questioning him. Vashka seemed to understand without being told. "The cellar was built right," she said. "The ground has changed. That's all." No insult in it. Inside, the air was wrong even though the cold held near enough to safe. It clung to the walls. Flour sacks had a faint gray bloom on them. Roots near the back shelf had begun putting out pale eyes far too early. Vashka studied the vents before she touched anything. The high west vent was too open for the way the wind now crossed the ridge. The low east side had no real pull at all. She opened a small lower vent on the east wall, narrowed the west vent with a fitted board, and set a shallow bowl of dry ash near the floor to show how fast the damp moved. Then she hung strips of burlap away from the stone so the sacks would not breathe directly against the wet rock. Nyza set a flat stone marker outside the new vent. Grull wrote the temperature twice a day on his slate. Only 3 days later the cellar held steady, dry and cool. The sour damp smell had faded. The flour felt dry to the hand again. Temperza stood in the cool dark and laid her palm flat against the wall Morduk had built. For a moment, grief and relief shared the same breath in her chest. Changing the cellar had not taken him away from her. It had helped his work last longer. She had not expected that to matter as much as it did. The first cold wind of the following weeks carried more than falling leaves. It also carried opinions, the way the frontier always did. Late one afternoon, Hyruk Dread, a neighboring orc who measured most things by muscle instead of patience, reined his horse beside the north barn. He watched in silence for a minute. Vashka pressed fresh clay and straw chinking deep into the narrow gaps between the lower wallboards. Orun packed the mixture firm with a wooden paddle. A few feet away, Grull stood outside the closed barn while his mother worked within. "Can you still see daylight?" she called through the wall. "A little," he answered. She packed another handful into the crack. Now? No, only then did she move to the next gap. Near the fowl shed, Nyza tied a strip of coarse sackcloth across the doorway, leaving the upper opening clear. Hyruk laughed at all of it. "That's nothing but mud for a field mouse," he called. "A holding needs strong men, not a widow patching the wind." No one answered him. Temperza heard every word from the porch. She said nothing. Inside the barn, Vashka finished the last section before checking the high vent beneath the roof. She left it open. Cold air at the animals' backs was one enemy. Damp air trapped overhead was another. Both had to be managed, and a fool managed neither. Fresh straw followed, spread deep enough to lift the cattle above the cold ground instead of merely covering it. When Hyruk finally rode away, the yard grew quiet again. Grull looked toward the road. "Why didn't you tell him he was wrong?" Vashka brushed the clay from her claws before she answered. "Because winter will answer better." The north wind slipped through the cottonwoods. This time, it found fewer places to enter the barn. The widow had lost everything a person could lose, and still she would not take back one word of it. If you have ever watched someone stand that straight with that little left to stand on, then you already know why the old orc could not look away, and you know you want to see how this ends. So stay with them. There is a whole winter still to come. The first hard frost arrived without warning, the way the worst of them always did. The grass that had bent green and living under the harvest moonwind stood stiff and white by morning, each blade sheathed in ice that snapped underfoot. The creek grew a skin along its edges. In the barn, the cattle crowded closer together and breathed great plumes into the cold, and the youngest calves pressed against the flanks of the older beasts for what warmth there was. It was not yet true winter. It was winter's first knock at the door, a test to see who had prepared and who had only meant to. Sometime before dawn, Temperza slipped quietly from her bed. She did not want to wake anyone just to draw water. It was a small pride, the kind old survivors keep long after the body has stopped being able to afford it. By sunrise, Vashka found her sitting beside the kitchen stove, one hand wrapped tight around her left wrist. A faint fever had colored her face, though she insisted it was nothing more than stiff old joints complaining at the cold. "I've drawn water from that well for 50 winters," she said, when Vashka reached for the wrist. "I don't need looking after." "No," Vashka agreed, and took the wrist anyway, gentle as she would her own child's. "But the well needs looking at, and that's a different thing." Vashka brewed willow bark tea and laid a warm cloth across the swollen wrist. Then she walked straight out to the well. The problem revealed itself within minutes. The rope no longer ran clean through the pulley. Years of rubbing against the wooden curb had frayed the fibers and pulled the line off center. Every bucket climbed the full depth of the well with more resistance than it should have. The well had slowly become heavier, not because the water had changed, but because the whole system had, one small worn thing at a time. Instead of replacing everything, Vashka reshaped what was already there. She had learned long ago that on a poor holding you did not throw out a thing because it had gone stiff. You found the one worn place and you eased it. She moved the pulley onto a new oak bracket to straighten the pull. She wrapped the worn edge of the well curb with thick rawhide to stop the rope from cutting any deeper into the wood. Then she hung a broad flat stone from the opposite side of the line as a simple counterweight, so the weight of the stone did half the lifting the arms used to do alone. Grull watched her work the whole while, saying nothing, learning with his eyes the way his father had taught him. When she finished, she stepped back and nodded at the rope. "Try it." By afternoon, the difference was plain. The boy gripped the rope with both hands and drew a full bucket to the surface without stopping once. He looked up at her, half startled, as if the well itself had changed its mind about him. "It's lighter," he said. "The water's the same weight it always was," Vashka said. "We just stopped fighting it." Temperza watched from the porch. For a long time she said nothing. Then she looked from the well to the boy, and back again. Helping had not made the holding weaker. It had made the work possible for hands that would one day replace her own. She had spent 4 winters believing those two things were opposites, that to accept help was to admit the land had beaten her, that the only honest way to keep Mordek's holding was to break herself against it exactly as he had. Alone, she was beginning to see that she had been wrong. Mordek had never worked that land alone. He had worked it with her. The alone part had come later, and she had mistaken her grief for a virtue. That evening she drank the willow bark tea without complaint and let Vashka wrap the wrist a second time and did not go out to the well again in the dark. While the outside of the holding slowly came back to life under Vashka's hands, inside the house there were still places locked away in grief. One door had stayed closed for near 4 years. Nisa found it by accident. She wandered down the narrow hallway while her mother scrubbed the supper pot and gently pushed against the old latch. The door opened only a few inches. Dust floated through the narrow beam of afternoon light. Inside stood a quilt frame, half covered by a faded canvas sheet. Folded scraps of fabric rested in a basket beside it, exactly where they had been left years before. On a small shelf sat a weathered tin with one word painted across the lid. Morduk. Near it rested a hand-drawn map of a shelter garden, showing rows of beans, sage, and flowers planted to slow the prairie wind before it reached the house. Temperza appeared almost at once. "Leave that room alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm as stone. Nisa froze. But instead of stepping away, she looked up at the old orc with plain, innocent curiosity. Did he plant things too? The question settled into the silence. Vashka started forward. "I'm sorry." She didn't know. Temperza slowly lifted one hand. No, she crossed the room herself, picked up the old seed tin, and brushed the years of dust from the lid. When she opened it, a few paper packets still rested inside. Calendula, pole beans. Sage, she smiled so faintly it almost disappeared before it formed. Morduk saved seed, she said softly, the way other folk save coin. Careful, always thinking of a spring he might not see. She tipped one tiny calendula seed into Nisa's open palm. The little girl closed her fingers around it as though it were something precious beyond price. Temperza watched without looking away. "When it comes up," the old orc said, "it'll be orange as a coal." He liked them by the door. Said a hard land needed something that wasn't only for eating. Nisa looked at her closed fist, then back up. "Can I plant it where he wanted?" Something moved behind the old orc's weathered face, quick as a bird crossing a window. "Yes," she said, "you can plant it where he wanted." That evening, for the first time in 4 years, the door to that room was left standing open. No one spoke of it. Vashka simply aired the quilt frame the next morning and swept the dust from the shelf, and set the seed tin back exactly where it had sat. And Temperza let her. Some memories were never meant to stay locked inside a room. Some were meant to be planted again, and let to grow where they could be seen. The first hard week of the frost moon brought another visitor. Silok Rook, Temperza's sister son, climbed down from a hired wagon wearing a clean wool coat and polished boots that had gathered almost no mud on the road from the far town. He embraced his aunt politely. Then his eyes settled on Vashka and the whelps, only for a moment, just long enough to decide they were temporary. Inside the house, Silok unfolded maps from a land broker and spoke with quiet confidence. "Railroad buyers are paying well. Guildmen, too, you're getting older. Aunt, this holding is too much for one person." He tapped the map. "Sell now, while it's worth something." His words sounded reasonable. That was the thing about Silok. Everything he said sounded reasonable, if you did not look too closely at what stood underneath it. His eyes never once wandered toward the barn, or the well, or the haystack. He did not ask how the calves had wintered, or whether the creek still ran clean, or what the ground gave back in a good year. To him the holding existed on paper before it existed on the land, and the paper was all he had come to read. "Blood is still blood," he added, warming to it. "Family should look after family. It's not right, an old woman out here alone with strangers under her roof and the snow coming on. Come to the town. Let the land go to men who can work it. There's no shame in it, Aunt, only sense." He glanced, once, at Vashka, where she stood by the stove. It was not a cruel look. It was worse than cruel. It was the look a man gives a chair he is about to move. Temperza remained silent. Then, without looking at Silok, she turned toward Vashka. If the pass closes by midwinter, she asked calmly, "How many days of feed do we have left?" Vashka looked at Gruel. The boy reached for his slate without hesitation. He read the figures aloud, clear and steady. Hay, grain, daily ration. Reserve set aside for the late storms. Sealok listened without speaking. When the boy finished, the room fell quiet. Sealok finally nodded toward him. The boy keeps good numbers. Temperza looked directly at her sister's son. His name, she said evenly, is Grull. For the first time since he had arrived, Sealok had nothing useful to add. He wanted to sell the land out from under all of them, and a boy of 11 winters with a slate had just closed his mouth for him. If you want to see this family make it through what's coming, stay close now. The pass is about to close, and the real test hasn't even begun. 2 days after Sealok returned to the far town, Temperza drove alone into the settlement. She never mentioned the trip to Vashka. Inside the small law office, Alden Peak, the settlement's lawkeeper, explained a working inheritance agreement. If Vashka remained at Cordrain, cared for the holding through the seasons, cared for Temperza when age finally demanded it, and kept the land productive, ownership could pass by law to her and the whelps. Temperza accepted the draft. She did not sign it. Back home, she slipped the folded papers beneath Morduk's leather ledger. Then she laid the pen down beside them and walked out onto the porch. Low gray clouds gathered along the western ridge. Winter would read that agreement before she ever did. By the middle of the frost moon, Cordrain moved by a new rhythm. The holding no longer drifted from chore to chore. It prepared. Vashka divided the hay into marked sections. Good feed for the hard nights, lesser feed for the warmer days. Emergency reserve under canvas, set aside where no one could touch it without saying why out loud. The grain sacks were measured by the week instead of guessed at by habit. Bedding straw was kept dry and lifted off the dirt floor. Every evening Grull opened Morduk's ledger and wrote the day's numbers. At first his hand was large and overly careful, the way whelps write when they know the page matters. Temperza watched him from the table without reaching for the book. At last she said, "Write smaller. Paper costs." That was all. It was enough. But something else was happening on those pages. Something the old orc noticed before she let herself feel it. The ledger had been Morduk's, and then for 4 years it had been hers alone. A record of slow decline written in a hand that grew shakier each season. This beast lost. This fence fallen. This repair put off another year. Now the entries ran the other way. Calves gained. Repairs finished. Feed holding steady against the coming cold. The boys' careful figures were writing the holding back to life, one line at a time. And the last page no longer belonged to a dead man or a dying way of things. It belonged to whatever came next. Temperza found she could not always look at it straight on. It was too much like hope, and hope was a thing she had taught herself to do without. Outside, Nisa pushed little sticks into the garden beds where spring seed would go. She tied scraps of cloth to each marker so they would not vanish under the snow. Oren helped set a rough snow fence from poles and brush along the stretch where the wind cut hardest across the calving side of the barn. Vashka hung a sackcloth curtain inside the main barn door, packed more clay straw into the low gaps, left the high vent open, and shifted the water trough away from the direct line of the wind. Temperza showed them where the drifts had killed calves 20 winters before, pointing with her staff at a low hollow near the calving pen where the snow always came to bury. She showed them how the low clouds caught on the ridge before a bad storm rolled in, hanging there heavy and gray like wet wool on a fence. She showed them the color of grass that held too much hidden frost in it, a dull silvered green that meant the ground beneath had already turned traitor. She was teaching, though she would not have called it that. For 4 winters she had carried all of it alone, every hard-won reading of the land locked up in one old head, waiting to die with her. Now she spoke it aloud to a widow and 2 whelps, and the speaking of it eased something she had not known was aching. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge already half lost. She had learned that from Morduk too, though it had taken his absence to teach it. It was in those days that the grain first came up short. Vashka noticed it the way she noticed everything, by the numbers not matching. A handful of meal gone from the store. Then a little more, small enough that a careless keeper would have blamed the mice. She did not blame the mice. She waited. The shadow came on the third night. She heard it before she saw it, a soft scrape at the far end of the barn, near the feed, and then the quick frightened stillness of something that knows it has been heard. She crossed the dark with a lantern held low and found not a thief but a whelp, a wild orc, small and half-frozen, ribs sharp under filthy skin, backed into the corner between the grain crib and the wall with the wide flat eyes of a creature that had learned, young and hard, to expect a boot. It could not have been more than 8 or 9 winters old. Out here, alone, in the cold coming on, that was a sentence. Vashka knew what the wild clans were. Folk the settled holdings drove off their land, and the towns drove out of their streets, scraping a living from the broken country, burying more of their young than they raised. She knew, too, what most keepers did when they found one in the barn with meal on its breath. She stood still a long moment. Then she set the lantern down slow, so as not to send it bolting into the storm, and she went to the kitchen, and she came back with a wool hide and a bowl of broth still warm from the bank stove. She set them on the straw a few feet from the corner and stepped back to give the thing room. "Eat," she said. "No one here will strike you for it." The wild whelp watched her the way a beaten dog watches an open hand. Then hunger won over fear, and it ate like it had forgotten food could be given instead of stolen, like it did not quite believe the bowl was real and meant to empty it before anyone changed their mind. Vashka crouched by the door and let it, and said nothing, and did not move. It was gone by morning, slipped back out into the cold on whatever hard road it walked. Vashka said nothing to anyone about it. She only left a little meal out at the barn's edge each night after, at the same hour, the way you leave water out for a creek that might yet run dry. Some nights it was taken. Some nights it was not. Grull found the empty bowl once and looked a long question at his mother across the barn. She only shook her head, and he, who understood better than most what it was to be a hungry child on a cold road, let it be. Some kindnesses you do without any thought of what they might grow into. You do them because the alternative is to become the kind of creature that would turn a starving child back out into a storm, and that is a colder thing than any winter. That one small kindness, done in the dark and spoken of to no one, would come walking back up out of the melting snow before the winter was through. Hyrek Dread rode past near sundown and laughed again, swaddling that barn like a babe. "Are you?" He gestured with his chin at the sackcloth curtain, the packed chinking, the slanted snow fence, all that fuss. "My grandsire kept 40 head on this ridge with nothing but a stone wall and a strong back. You'll wear yourselves to the bone chasing every draft, and the cold'll come anyway." "It will," Vashka agreed, not looking up from her work. "That's rather the point." Hyrek snorted and rode on, certain in the way that men are certain right up until the moment the world corrects them. No one stopped working. The holding was not being wrapped like a babe. It was being readied for judgment, and judgment does not care what your grandsire kept, or how strong your back was in the years before this one. It cares only what you did with the autumn you were given. The first sign came before the snow. Temperza stepped onto the porch before daylight and stood perfectly still. The clouds rode lower than they should. The wind carried the faint smell of iron in it. She looked toward the western ridge, and something old and certain settled in her chest. "It comes tonight," she said. The storm was at the door now, and every single repair those hands had made was about to be tested at once. The chinking, the trench, the vents, the well, the deep dry bedding. Every board Vashka had touched, This was the part the old orc had warned them about, the part where winter reads back everything you tried to hide from it. If you want to know whether this family survives what's coming down off that ridge, do not go anywhere. The judgment starts now. By sundown, the sky had disappeared. It went in the space of an hour. First, the western ridge blurred and vanished behind a wall of gray. Then the near pasture. Then the fence at the yard's edge, and finally the yard itself, until there was nothing beyond the porch rail but a white, roaring void. The temperature dropped so fast that the wet mud at the trough froze mid-churn, catching the ruts of the day and hard ridges of ice. Then the blizzard struck. Fast, hard, relentless. The north wind searched every board, every corner, every weakness it had found in the years before, when an old woman worked the land alone and could not get to every failing edge before the cold did. It came howling down off the broken country the way it had for 1,000 winters, and it expected to find the same holding it had always found. The gap under the barn door, the thin spot in the north wall, the haystack rotting quietly at its base. This time it found fewer. Snow piled against the brush fence instead of burying the barn door. The drifts climbed higher and higher, but the entrance stayed open, because Vashka had set that fence at a slant weeks before to make the snow climb the fence instead of the wall. Oren had shaken his head at the labor of it at the time. He was not shaking it now. Inside the barn, the air was still bitterly cold, but it no longer sliced across the cattle's backs. The clay and straw chinking held in the low gaps. The high vent carried the damp air away overhead, while the packed lower walls kept the draft outside where it belonged. The deep bedding stayed dry. The youngest calves remained on their feet. The water trough formed only a thin rim of ice instead of freezing solid to the bottom. Below the house, the root cellar held steady between cool and cold, neither warm enough to spoil nor cold enough to freeze. The flower stayed dry. The roots rested quiet without sending out a single pale shoot. Outside, the sloped thatch shed the blowing snow off the haystack, and the meltwater drained into the shallow trench instead of soaking up into the lower bales. Every repair was being tested now, one by one, and one by one they held. Vashka organized the work without ever raising her voice. She did not need to. She had spent the whole autumn teaching each of them their place in exactly this kind of night. And now the night had come, and each of them stepped into that place without being told. Oren checked the livestock through the long, dark hours, moving from beast to beast with a shielded lantern, breaking the thin ice on the trough before it could thicken, running his rough hands down the flanks of the youngest calves to feel for the deep shivering that meant a beast was losing its fight with the cold. There was little of it. The deep bedding and the sealed walls had done their work. The cattle were cold, but they were not dying. And on a night like this, that was the whole of the difference between a holding that lasts and one that does not. Gruel carried lanterns from barn to house and back, counted the cattle after every round, and entered each number into the ledger before the ink could freeze in the pot. He kept the pot itself near the stove between entries, carrying it back and forth under his coat, and the care of it was its own small heroism. When his hands grew too stiff to shape the figures, he warmed them at the fire and went back out again, because his father had taught him that numbers kept in the head are numbers already lost, and a holding is saved or lost on whether anyone bothered to write the truth down while it was still true. Inside the kitchen, Nisa fed small pieces of cottonwood into the stove and held Morduke's seed tin close against her lap, as if the seeds inside it needed keeping warm too. She did not cry, though she was young enough that no one would have blamed her for it. She had watched her mother stand straight at the bottom of a stranger's porch steps, with nothing left in the world. And she had learned from that, the way whelps learn everything, without knowing she was learning it. Near midnight, Temperza slipped on packed snow inside the barn and nearly went down. Before she reached the ground, Vashka caught her. Neither of them spoke. Temperza did not pull away. For the first time in many years, she allowed someone else to carry part of the weight while the storm outside finished delivering its judgment. The old orc's hand closed around the younger one's forearm, and it stayed there a moment longer than it needed to, and that was all. Some things pass between two people without a single word, and both of them the stronger for it. The blizzard entered its second day, then its third. Visibility stretched no farther than the barn fence. Near noon on the third day, a shape emerged through the blowing snow. It was Hyrok. His shoulders were bent against the wind. In his arms, wrapped inside his own coat, lay a newborn calf, barely able to lift its head. He reached the porch without a word and stood there a moment. And the man who had laughed at mud for a field mouse could not quite meet the old orc's eyes. "My north wall gave way," he said at last. The words came hard. "The hay got wet weeks ago. I never moved it." He looked down at the small shape in his arms. "2 calves are gone already. This one's still breathing." The laughter was gone out of him entirely. There was only a tired man in a failing storm, holding the last living thing he had managed to save. "Then bring it in," Temperza said. Nothing more. Vashka was already moving. "Gruel, the burlap. Nisa, warm a kettle. Oren, fresh straw, the driest we've got." No one wasted time asking questions. This was the kind of night the whole autumn had been practiced for, and the practice showed. The calf was rubbed dry with fistfuls of clean straw, laid deep into the warmest corner of the bedding, and covered over with burlap, while warm water was brought from the kettle a little at a time and worked patiently between its jaws. Nisa knelt and rubbed the small, cold legs between her hands the way she had rubbed her own on winter mornings. Gruel held the lantern close for warmth without being asked. Oren banked fresh straw around the whole of it to hold what heat there was. The little animal shivered through the night, its breath coming in shallow rattles, and more than once its eyes rolled back and its sides went still long enough that Hyrok's jaw tightened and Vashka's hands moved faster. Each time, she worked a little more warm water past its teeth, rubbed a little harder at the cold, stunned blood, spoke to it, low and steady, in the old tongue, the way you speak to any frightened creature that has given up. Each time, after a terrible moment, the small sides heaved and drew breath again. By dawn, it stood. It stood on 4 splayed, shaking legs and bawled, thin and furious and alive, for milk. The sound of it filled the cold barn like something holy, like the first bird after a long silence. Hyrok stood over it a long while and did not trust himself to speak. He had lost 2 of his own to the same storm, in the same hours, for the want of a wall he had never troubled to seal. And here, in a stranger's barn, in the bedding a widow had banked, the 3rd one he'd carried through the dark on a fool's hope had lived to greet the morning. Outside the barn, in the thin gray light after the worst of the storm had passed, Hyrok stood quietly before the north wall. His eyes followed the clay and straw chinking he had mocked only weeks before, sealed hard and tight between every lower board. He reached out and pressed one finger against the hardened seal. It did not give. Then he turned toward Vashka. "What's the mix?" he asked. No apology came. But the question itself had become one, and both of them knew it. Vashka explained the proportions, the moisture, how tightly the mixture should be packed around the lower boards, where to leave the high vent open so the damp could climb out overhead. She never once looked toward Temperza while she spoke. She simply gave the man what he needed, the way she gave everyone what they needed, without making him crawl for it. Temperza, however, watched her for a long time. Not as a guest, not as a widow who had once asked for shelter at the bottom of the porch steps. For the first time, the old orc saw someone who already carried the instincts of the next keeper of Cordrain. The storm finally loosened its grip. Snow began melting from the south-facing slopes, and the windmill turned again after Orin fitted a new vein where the old one had broken years before. Water ran once more, and the holding shook itself loose from the ice like a beast rising from a long, cold sleep. It was 2 mornings after the wind died that the debt came back around, though not the kind a broker keeps. The wild whelp came out of the melting drifts at the edge of the west pasture, the same half-frozen creature Vashka had fed in the dark of the barn, ribs no longer so sharp, eyes no longer so flat. It did not come alone. Behind it came 3 more of its own, gaunt and wary, a small, ragged clan of wild orcs who had weathered the storm in some hole in the broken country and come out the far side of it with almost nothing. They were dragging a rough sled behind them. On it lay a load of dry deadfall wood, gathered from some sheltered draw the snow had missed, and a heap of frozen roots and dried marsh grass. Poor feed, but feed, and more than folk with nothing to spare should have carried across that country. The wild whelp stopped at the fence line and would come no farther. It looked at Vashka. Then it looked at the sled. Then it stepped back, the way you step back from a debt you have done your best to pay. Vashka walked out to the fence alone. She looked at the wood and the poor frozen feed and the 4 thin faces watching her to see what she would do. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. The wild whelp only looked at her. "But I'm glad you did." She unlatched the gate. "There's broth on the stove and room in the barn out of the wind. You've paid your way and more. Come in out of the cold." They came in slow and wary, and they did not stay long. But they stayed long enough to be warm and to be fed, and to learn that there was one holding on the ridges where a wild orc would not be met with a boot. A kindness done in the dark, expecting nothing, had come back through the melting snow with wood on a sled. That was how the frontier truly worked, under all its hardness, not blood for blood, but hand for hand. The clan at Cordrain was no longer alone on its ridge, and it never would be again. A week later, Seelock returned. He expected to find exhaustion, failure, perhaps a holding finally ready to be sold, an old woman finally ready to be reasonable, a widow and 2 whelps finally moved along like furniture from a room. Instead, Cordrain was working. The cattle were alive. Hay still filled the reserve stack under its canvas. The root cellar smelled clean instead of damp. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. The windmill turned. The whole place had the quiet order of a holding that had looked winter in the eye and not blinked. Seelock stepped into the kitchen and removed his gloves and some of his confidence with them. "This place still needs a man to manage it," he said. No one answered immediately. Then Gruel quietly placed his slate beside Morduk's ledger and opened both. He read the figures in a calm, clear voice, the way his father had taught him, the way he had done every evening all winter long. Feed remaining. Calves alive after the blizzard. Egg production before the storm, during it, and after. Days the mountain pass had stayed closed, water drawn from the well. Every number matched, every number held. When he paused, Vashka added only one small correction about the grain reserve, a half sack she had moved to the emergency store and not yet entered. Nothing more. She did not gloat. She did not so much as look at Seelock. She simply set the number right, because a number that is wrong is a lie, and she did not keep lies in Morduk's ledger. Temperza closed the ledger gently. "This holding doesn't need someone named Rook," she said. "It needs someone who knows where it breathes, where it leaks, and where it goes hungry." Seelock looked down at the final line the boy had written on the slate. "Calves alive." He searched for an argument. He was a man who had always been able to find one, who had built a whole life on the ability to make the reasonable-sounding thing and the profitable thing appear to be the same thing. But the numbers had already answered every argument before he could shape it. There is nothing a man like Seelock can say to a column of figures that has come out right, any more than he can argue a standing barn into being a fallen one. He stood there a moment in the warm kitchen that smelled of clean cellar and wood smoke and something cooking, and perhaps, for just that moment, he understood what he was looking at. Not a burden to be sold, a living thing, kept alive through the worst the ridges could throw, by hands that had asked for nothing but the work. He rode away that afternoon. He did not embrace his aunt before he went, but he did, at the gate, rein in and look back once at the barn and the turning windmill and the small figure of a boy crossing the yard with a bucket that no longer fought him. Whatever he saw there, he kept it to himself all the long road back to the town. And he did not come again with a broker's maps. Some men cannot be argued out of their smallness. But even a small man can be shamed silent by a thing done well. And that was victory enough. After Seelock had gone, Temperza asked Vashka to join her on the porch. The late winter sun rested low across the pasture, gold and thin. Without ceremony, the old orc placed a folded document on the table between them. Morduk's ledger rested beneath it. "It's a working inheritance agreement," she said. "If you stay. If you keep this land alive, care for it through every season, care for me when I can no longer care for myself, and teach Gruel and Nisa to do the same, then Quardrain will become yours. Theirs." Vashka did not reach for the paper. Instead, she unfolded it carefully, and she read every page. She read the way she did everything, slow and complete, missing nothing. She asked about outstanding debts, water rights, the cattle brand, the fence lines, Oren's place on the holding, and whether it was secure. She did not ask out of greed. She asked out of the same instinct that had drawn a chalk line beside a damp wall. She was hunting the whole shape of the thing before she set her hand to it. Temperza's mouth softened into the faintest of smiles. That was exactly why she had chosen her. A person who grabbed at the paper without reading it was a person who would grab at the land the same way and let it fail the same way, unread and untended at the edges where holdings die. Vashka had drawn a chalk line beside a damp wall and waited 3 days to learn the truth of it. She would read this paper the same way she read the land, all the way to the roots. "You'll want to know," Temperza said, "that there's a lien still standing against the West Quarter from Morduk's last bad year. I never cleared it. I never had the coin, and then I never had the will." It cost her something to say it. She had never spoken that failure aloud to a living soul. "It's a small thing, but it's yours to carry now if you take this. I won't hand you a burden dressed up as a gift and pretend the burden isn't there." Vashka nodded slowly and folded that fact in with all the others, the way she folded a hide into a door gap. "Then we'll clear it," she said. "The cabs this spring will more than cover it, if the weight holds. It'll hold." "I am not giving you land," the old orc said quietly. "I am giving you work that will outlive me. It will not end. There is no season it lets you rest. It took the best years I had, and it took Morduk in the end. And it will take from you, too, everything you have, one bucket and one repair at a time. Vashka met her eyes, and there was no fear in her, and no illusion either. I know what work is, she said. I buried a good man to it. And I would rather break myself on land that's mine and my children's than beg on a road that leads nowhere. She set her hand flat on the folded paper, not to claim it, but the way you set a hand on the shoulder of something you mean to keep. Then I will not take it lightly. No, Temperza said. I don't believe you will. Spring arrived the way it often did on the frontier, not in a single warm day, but one quiet change at a time. Snow retreated from the southern slopes. Water returned to the creek without flooding this time, running clear and full between banks that held. The meadow birds found their voices again in the mornings. The stiff, silvered grass went green from the roots up, and this time the green was true, with no hidden frost waiting underneath it. Quardrain had done more than survive. It had thrived. The root cellar remained dry through the last of the freezes, the flower sound, the seed roots firm and waiting. The hay reserve outlasted the final hard nights with feed to spare, so that when the neighboring holdings were scraping the bottoms of their stacks and losing thin beasts to the last cold snaps, Quardrain still had enough to lend. And the great horned cattle carried better weight than any herd on any neighboring holding, their calves standing strong and sound in the lengthening light, dropped early and kept alive through a winter that had killed calves on lands with 3 times the hands. Word of it traveled the way word does. A keeper 2 ridges over rode out one morning to see the slanted snow fence for himself and to ask, awkwardly, about the mix for the chinking. Vashka told him. She told anyone who asked. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge half lost. She had learned that from the old woman, who had learned it too late and paid for the lesson. And neither of them meant to make that mistake again. The things that had kept one holding alive through one hard winter began, quietly, to spread along the ridges, one honest answer at a time. The land was no longer merely bracing itself against winter. It was preparing for new life, and so was everything on it. Oren shared the story in the settlement without boasting, simply stating the fact of it. The widow, the whelps, the old woman, the winter they had all come through together. Folk listened. Some of them looked at their own leaning fences afterward and thought. Hirak Dread's silent apology arrived a few days later in the form of a wagon load of clean, dry straw left beside the barn. There was no note with it. No words were needed. On that ridge, action had become the only language that truly mattered, and Hirak had finally learned to speak it. Late one afternoon, Temperza rested in Morduk's old carved seat on the porch, a black wool shawl folded across her shoulders against the last of the cold. Across the yard, Vashka firmly latched the newly repaired barn door. She no longer worked with the careful hesitation of a guest under someone else's roof. She worked with the steady hands of a woman planning for the next year and the year after that. From the garden, Nisa came running, carefully cradling a small clay pot in both hands, mindful of it the whole way as though she carried an egg or a coal. In the center of it stood a single vibrant sprout, green shading toward the first faint hint of orange at its crown. A calendula. Grown from the one seed the old woman had tipped into her palm from a dead man's tin, planted where he had wanted it by the door, come up first of all the garden, ahead of the beans and the turnips and everything else that would feed them through the year. "Gran," she beamed, placing it gently in Temperza's lap. "This one came up first." Temperza looked down at the small green thing in the small clay pot, and something in the old orc's chest that had been shut 4 winters came quietly open. It was orange at the crown, exactly the color he had loved, exactly where he had planted them every year of their long life together. Not for eating, for the simple defiance of it. Something bright and living on a hard land that gave nothing away for free. She never corrected the word. Gran. She had borne no whelps of her own. There had been no one to call her that, not ever. And she had made her peace with it a lifetime ago, the way you make peace with a fence line you cannot move. Now, a child she had met at the bottom of her porch steps with a seed pouch clutched like a doll, stood at her knee and called her Gran, and meant it. And the old orc let the words stand and did not trust herself to speak. Her weathered hand rested gently on the little girl's head and stayed there. Beside her, Grull paused his pencil for only a heartbeat before quietly finishing the day's entry in the old leather ledger. The numbers were perfectly balanced, the way they had been all through the winter, the way they would go on being. The windmill turned smooth in the evening breeze. Children's voices drifted across the pasture, and somewhere out in the barn, a calf that should have died in a blizzard bawled strong for its milk. And for the first time since Morduk was laid to rest on the quiet slope beyond the pasture, the old holding no longer belonged to a woman waiting alone in the past. It belonged to a family that had earned its place. One season, one repair, and one quiet act of faithfulness at a time.